You've probably had the emergency fund conversation with yourself exactly once. You heard the standard advice, keep 3 to 6 months of living expenses in cash. You picked a number, opened a savings account, set up automatic transfers, and checked the box. Since then, you probably haven't thought about it again. That silence could be costing you hundreds of dollars every year. And here's the part most people don't realize. There's a good chance you're one of the people leaving that money on the table, and you already think you've done everything right. Maybe you upgraded to a high-yield savings account. You compared rates, chose a reputable bank, and felt like you had optimized your emergency fund. But what almost nobody tells you is that a high-yield savings account isn't the final answer. It's simply a better version of the same system. Once you understand why, you'll never think about the word safe the same way again. When was the last time you asked yourself whether your emergency fund is actually in the best place? Not whether you've saved enough. That's a completely different question. The real question is this account still working for me? Or has my money been sitting in the same place for the last 4 years simply because moving it never made it onto my to-do list? For most people, the honest answer is uncomfortable. An emergency fund no longer feels like an active financial decision. It feels finished. You check the balance. You keep contributing. The number slowly grows. That feels responsible. But somewhere along the way, you stopped evaluating the account itself because the moment it became a habit, it stopped feeling like a choice. Behavioral economists call this the status quo bias, our tendency to stick with what's familiar, not because it's the best option, but because changing feels riskier than doing nothing, even when doing nothing is the bigger risk. There's another force at work too, familiarity bias. Maybe your emergency fund is at a bank you've known for years. You've seen the commercials. Their app is already on your phone. You recognize the logo every time you log in. Without realizing it, your brain translates that familiarity into trust, safe, reliable. No reason to look elsewhere. Neither of these instincts is irrational. Your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do. Familiar things usually feel safer. New options require time and effort to evaluate. In most parts of life, that's a useful shortcut. In personal finance, it's often a profitable shortcut for your bank. Together, these two biases quietly keep your money exactly where it is, earning as little as possible for as long as possible. So what is actually happening while your emergency fund sits there being safe? Most people never learn how a savings account really works. When you deposit money, the bank isn't storing it in a vault waiting for you to come back. They're borrowing it from you. According to FDIC data from early 2026, the average traditional savings account pays around 0.38% interest. The bank pays you that small return, then immediately puts your money to work for its own profit. Mortgage loans are currently earning banks around 6.3%. Auto loans are closer to 7%. Personal loans can generate roughly 12%, and the average credit card APR in early 2026 sits around 21%. Think about that. The bank pays you 0.38% while charging credit card customers around 21%. That difference, the spread between what they pay depositors and what they earn lending the same money, is the foundation of the banking business. And there's another piece most people never notice. Banks also invest part of their deposits in short-term U.S. Treasury bills. Right now, 3-month Treasury bills are yielding roughly 3.7%. The bank earns around 3.7% using your money. You receive 0.38%. Pause and think about that for a moment. Treasury bills aren't some exclusive investment available only to banks. You can buy them yourself. In many cases, the bank is simply acting as the middleman between you and the U.S. Treasury, while keeping more than 3 percentage points of the return, the average net interest margin for U.S. banks, the official term for this spread, reached about 3.39% in 2025, its highest level since 2019. That same year, JPMorgan Chase generated more than $93 billion in net interest income alone. That's the difference between what it paid depositors and what it earned using those deposits. None of this is unethical. It's not a hidden scam. It's simply a business model that works incredibly well, as long as most customers never stop to examine it. Now, to be clear, switching to a high-yield savings account is absolutely an improvement, a meaningful one. At around 4%, you're earning more than 10 times the national average. On a $25,000 emergency fund, that's roughly $1,000 per year instead of about $95. That's a significant gain from making one smart decision. But take one step back. A high-yield savings account isn't a fundamentally different product. It's the exact same machine running a little faster while giving you a slightly larger share of the profits. The bank is still buying the same treasury bills, still making the same loans, still earning the same spreads. The only reason you're getting paid more is because online competition forced banks to share a little more of what they were already earning. You found a better deal, but you're still playing the same game. And this is where the status quo bias quietly shows up again. Finding a better version of what you already had feels like finishing the job. Your brain checks the box and the decision disappears from your radar. But there's another piece of the puzzle that almost nobody explains clearly. It has to do with taxes. More specifically, it comes down to a provision in federal tax law that has existed for decades, yet most people have never even heard of it. Let's run the numbers. Imagine you have the same $25,000 set aside for emergencies over the course of 1 year. In the first scenario, it's sitting in a traditional savings account earning 0.38% APY. That generates about $95 in interest. After paying federal income tax at 22% and state income tax at 5%, you're left with roughly $69. That's the cost of accepting the default option. Now look at a high-yield savings account paying 4% APY. That same $25,000 earns about $1,000 in interest. Because savings account interest is fully taxable at both the federal and state level, you keep approximately $730 after taxes. That's more than 10 times better than the traditional account. A genuinely meaningful improvement. Now, let's look at a third option. Instead of using a savings account, you invest that emergency fund in short-term U.S. Treasury bills, currently yielding around 3.7%. On $25,000, that produces roughly $925 in interest. At first glance, that looks worse than earning $1,000. And before taxes, it is, but that's not the comparison that actually matters. Interest earned from U.S. Treasury securities is exempt from state and local income taxes. That exemption has been part of federal law for generations. States simply cannot tax that income. So while the high-yield savings account investor pays both federal and state taxes on every dollar of interest earned, the Treasury investor only pays federal income tax. Run the math using a 5% state income tax. The high-yield savings account leaves you with about $730 after taxes. The Treasury investment leaves you with roughly $1,792. They're almost identical. Now change just one variable, where you live. If you're in a state with a 9% income tax, like California, or a high-tax state such as New York, the numbers shift. After taxes, the high-yield savings account falls to roughly $690. The Treasury investment still keeps about $700 because that state tax never applies. Add local income taxes on top of that, and the gap grows even wider. The higher your state tax rate, the more valuable that exemption becomes. There's one more difference worth thinking about. Your bank decides what interest rate to pay on your high-yield savings account. If it wants to lower that rate tomorrow, it can. No approval from you, no negotiation. No warning beyond an email you may never read. Treasury yields work differently. They're determined by public treasury auctions and broader market conditions, not by a bank deciding how aggressively it wants to compete for deposits. The point isn't that treasury bills always come out ahead. The point is that the comparison is much closer than most people realize. And in many higher tax states, the numbers already favor treasuries. It's a factor most people with emergency funds never even think to evaluate. So what does this actually look like in practice? It's simpler than most people expect. One option is to buy a short-term treasury bill ETF. You can do that through virtually any brokerage account, Fidelity, Charles Schwab, Vanguard, or whichever platform you already use. You purchase it just like you would a stock. The fund invests in treasury bills with maturities of 3 months or less and typically distributes interest monthly. At today's yields, that's roughly 3.5% to 3.7% annually. When you need your money, you simply sell your shares during regular market hours. Settlement generally takes 1 or 2 business days. Expense ratios for funds like these are extremely low, often around 0.09%. On a $25,000 balance, that's only about $23 per year. And depending on where you live, much of that interest may still qualify for state and local tax exemption. A second option is TreasuryDirect.gov, the U.S. Treasury's own website. It's the most direct approach possible. No brokerage, no ETF, no fund expenses. You create an account, connect your bank, and purchase Treasury bills directly from the government. Terms like 4 weeks, 8 weeks, and 13 weeks are available through regular auctions. When the bill matures, you receive your original investment plus the interest you've earned. The trade-off is liquidity. Your money remains committed until maturity, unless you sell the security through the secondary market. If you're confident you won't need those funds for several weeks at a time, it's one of the simplest ways to eliminate the middleman entirely. A third option is a Treasury-only money market fund. Most major brokerages offer them. These funds invest exclusively in short-term U.S. government securities, generally receive the same state tax advantages, and provide daily liquidity. If you want something that feels almost identical to a savings account, deposit money, withdraw money, and avoid learning the mechanics of buying and selling securities, this is probably the easiest place to start. None of these approaches require hiring a financial advisor. None of them involve taking on significant investment risk. What they do require is being willing to question whether the place your money has always lived is still the best place for it. Whenever this conversation comes up, two objections almost always follow, and both deserve a thoughtful answer. The first is simple. My savings account is FDIC insured. That's true. Treasury bills aren't covered by FDIC insurance, but there's an important distinction that often gets overlooked. FDIC insurance protects up to $250,000 per depositor if a bank fails. That's a valuable safeguard. But ask yourself what ultimately stands behind that guarantee. The FDIC is a federal agency backed by the U.S. government. When you buy a Treasury bill, you're not depositing money at a bank that's insured by the government. You're lending directly to the U.S. government itself. Treasury securities are backed by the full faith and credit of the United States. So when you move from a savings account to Treasury bills, you're not necessarily giving up safety. You're simply removing one layer between you and the same underlying issuer. In other words, you're moving closer to the source of the guarantee, not farther away. The second objection is one you hear all the time. I need my emergency fund to be available immediately. And that's a completely reasonable concern. That's exactly why you keep money in your checking account for everyday expenses and unexpected short-term needs. Nothing about this changes that, but think honestly about the last time you needed your entire emergency fund within a matter of hours. A major car repair, an emergency flight, an unexpected medical expense. Most real-world emergencies don't require you to produce thousands of dollars before the next business day. For many people, a settlement period of 1 or 2 business days is more than enough. Meanwhile, maintaining instant access to your entire emergency fund every single day of every year comes with a real cost. On a $25,000 balance, that cost can easily amount to hundreds of dollars annually. That's a measurable price to pay for a level of liquidity that, statistically speaking, most people will rarely, if ever, actually need. You did exactly what you were supposed to do. You built an emergency fund. You kept it in the bank. You contributed consistently. You checked the balance. You followed the financial advice you were given. Then you learned a little more. You upgraded to a high-yield savings account. Instead of earning what the average saver earns, you started earning many times more. It felt like you had solved the problem. But there was one question almost nobody asked. What is my bank doing with my money? And perhaps more importantly, could I do some of that myself? In many cases, the answer is yes. Your bank accepts your deposits. It buys Treasury securities. It makes mortgages, auto loans, personal loans, and credit card loans. It earns substantially more on that money than it pays you. That's how the business works. So maybe the smartest financial move isn't simply finding a higher paying savings account. Maybe it's asking whether you need a traditional savings account for all of your emergency cash in the first place. Now, that doesn't mean a high yield savings account is the wrong choice. For many people, it may still be the best fit. The point of this video was never to convince you to abandon it. The point was to make sure your decision is intentional, not automatic. If this changed the way you think about where your cash is sitting, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who hasn't questioned their emergency fund since the day they opened the account. Here, we break down personal finance, investing, and the money decisions that too often go unexplained. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.